And this will be our final session where we'll hear from advocates, gather your ideas, and explore what has worked well in research to drive meaningful change. And just before I introduce our next guest, I'd like to say that I acknowledge that there has been a lot of questions that we weren't able to get to. However, these have been noted and we will have a look at those later. So, our first speaker for this session is Megan Spindler-Smith, Deputy CEO of People with Disability Australia. Megan will share what advocates say are missing in terms of the research gaps and highlight what people with disability have been calling for when it comes to eliminating restrictive practices. Megan, thank you very much for joining us, and I'll hand the floor to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jane. For those of you that I have not had a chance yet to meet, as said, I am Megan Spindler-Smith. I use they, them pronouns, and I am joining from unceded Darug country in the Hawkesbury. For those who would like a visual description, I am a larger bodied, pale, femme-presenting person with red hair that is tied up, and I'm wearing glasses and have red lipstick and a blue top on. So, restrictive practices have already been shown throughout this really important discussion to lead to harm for many people with disability, including myself. From an advocacy perspective, eliminating restrictive practices has to be through consistent advocacy and empowering people with disability to be the leaders and co-designers of the research as pathways that prioritise our safety, thereby achieving academic and systemic change. So what is missing? What we actually need from a systemic advocacy perspective is to ensure that a pathway to elimination of restrictive practices can be the reality it should be. Firstly, we need to acknowledge we need our government decision makers, our practitioners, our supports, and people with disability to fully understand what restrictive practices are. Recognising that regulated violence is not acceptable. Acknowledging these actions violate the autonomy and dignity of people with disability and often occur without our understanding or our consent. Research should focus on systemic drivers and opportunities for elimination. The lack of consistency across Australia in our practices means that unified definitions and standards are critical to creating consistency, safeguarding rights, and ensuring advocacy is both effective and impactful. However, this pathway cannot start without knowledge and education created by the disabled perspective through research-driven knowledge creation. Next slide. Empowering people with disability starts by understanding what safety means from our perspective. Feeling secure, respected, and free from fear is an inalienable human right. Elimination of practices that restrict our freedom create long-term trauma or dehumanize us. Research that can support systemic advocacy needs to be led by and with us. It must focus on how systems can better invest in supported decision-making, individual advocacy, and culturally safe, trauma-informed approaches. These measures are essential to ensuring that we, people with disability, are not only safe but empowered. Effective research in this space is currently hampered by the limited number of people with disability allowed to be part of research. The academic field is not disability affirming and creates barriers to participation that come from accessibility and ethics restrictions that directly create limiting barriers. So, co-designed and led research is key. Having us as people with disability shaping research ensures findings are relevant, actionable, and focused on solutions, not just on understanding the impacts or the prevalence. It's also about building knowledge and resources that can educate and empower both systemic and self-advocacy. For systemic change through advocacy, we need a strong base of research that does not medicalise or quantify our experience. Disability-led participatory research ensures people with disability lead the development of solutions with government and the decision makers. These frameworks centred on lived experiences ensure outcomes are grounded in the realities faced by those directly affected. Research priorities should include identifying systemic drivers of restrictive practices, developing trauma-informed approaches, and creating tools for rights awareness and supported decision-making. Understanding the long-term impacts of restrictive practices, even ones that have been co-developed, is integral. Co-led and designed research not only addresses barriers, but empowers people with disability to have the control in our lives. The one thing we have to be very clear of, though, is that there is no one-size-fits-all people with disability for what security, safety, and bodily autonomy is. Systemic change needs to acknowledge the flexibility that is required for us to have contextualized and individualized approaches for person-centered elimination of restrictive practices. More regulation of acceptable practices will not actually create safety. Next slide. So where can we go from here? I have two questions for you. How are you making sure that the research that you do centres us? How can you make sure that the barriers to leading and engaging in this research are dismantled? Open up pathways for research to be led, developed by, and with those directly impacted by restrictive practices. The need for research ensuring people with disability have direct control over our lives will ensure that we can co-create solutions that address the systemic drivers for change and that empower us. This is imperative for systemic change. Implementing truly person-centered supported decision-making frameworks where individual preferences and goals shape supports and services will make the difference to changing how it happens as a systemic level. We need consistent Australian-wide definitions and standards. Without those, a pathway to elimination is halted. The way forward requires collaboration, consistency, and action. Elimination pathways must integrate lived experience, co-designed tools, and participatory research. Together, we can ensure people with disability live with dignity, autonomy, and freedom from restrictive practices. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Megan, and especially for posing those really powerful questions there. Really fantastic to hear the insights and messages from advocates working on the ground, and it's a real reminder of why we're here today and why this work is really important. Very much appreciate your message and presentation.